Welcome to Missing Dots. History isn't just written by the victors. It is hidden in the margins of ancient manuscripts and overlooked archives, where modern polemics and oversimplified myths often cloud the real truth. To uncover what actually happened, you have to bypass the propaganda, ignore the emotional debates, and audit the raw, forensic evidence left behind. Welcome to the Missing Dots, the forensic audit of the ancient world. Here we connect the forgotten archives, the silent languages, and the missing pieces of data to expose the historical reality you were never meant to see. So I was going through that absolute mountain of research you sent over this week.
Oh yeah, there was a lot in that stack.
It really was.
Yeah.
But honestly, looking through it all, it completely reframed a historical debate that I thought I understood.
Yeah.
Because for you listening right now, we are dealing with a topic that is incredibly toxic online.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. It gets very heated.
Right. You look up anything about the early Islamic conquest and you just hit this wall of like centuries of internet debates, modern polemics, heavy medieval theories, just all clashing. So today, we're just bypassing all of that. We're looking at the actual raw Incan papyrus financial ledgers from 7th and 8th century Egypt and the Levant.
Which is really the only way to get a clear picture. Because, the polarization you're talking about is very real. On one side, you have secular critics who argue that the early Islamic tax system, so specifically the Jizyah and the Kharaj, was this brutal, humiliating protection racket, like designed to just economically crush non-Muslims.
Right.
But then on the flip side, you have some modern apologists who swing in the complete opposite direction, and they try to reduce the jizya to this tiny nominal welfare fee, which, that completely ignores the very harsh logistical reality of running an empire in late antiquity.
Exactly. Which is why I think we need to make our stance crystal clear right at the start. We are absolutely not taking a theological side here, and we are not taking a political side. We're just looking at the cold, hard archaeological facts left behind in ancient tax receipts.
Yeah, just the accounting.
Right, just the math. So the question we're really asking today is what happens when this popular narrative of, conversion by the sword collides with the incredibly mundane reality of ancient bureaucrats who are just trying to balance a regional budget.
And when you look at the physical evidence, that narrative of a chaotic, predatory horde sweeping in and destroying everything, it just evaporates.
It really does.
Yeah. Specifically, we're looking at research on the Aphrodite papyri from Upper Egypt, which is from around 709 to 715, and also the Nasana documents from the Negev desert.
And these aren't like history books written centuries later, right?
No, not at all. These are the actual day-to-day administrative receipts. It's the letters left behind by the people who physically lived through that transition from Byzantine rule to Islamic rule.
Let's zoom in on that Aphrodite archive for a second, because the cast of characters is fascinating. We have these letters between Korda ibn Sharek, who was the Umayyad governor of Egypt, and a man named Basilios. And Basilios wasn't some imprisoned captive. He was a Christian patriarch, so basically a district governor, a very wealthy local elite.
Yeah, and the tone of their letters is it's so revealing. When you read what Governor Korra is sending down to Basilios, you don't find theological arguments. You don't find religious mandates.
No, it's just paperwork.
Exactly. It's strict, almost obsessive bureaucracy. Korra is he's demanding accurate agricultural surveys. He's asking for specific quotas of wheat for the state granaries. He's requisitioning carpenters and sailors to maintain the fleet. Fundamentally, an empire is just a massive logistics company.
Right. It's all supply chain management. And, when I was reading about how this administration was set up, it honestly reminded me of a modern corporate acquisition.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. Imagine a massive global company buys out a regional competitor. The new owners, in this case, the Umayyads, they step in, they take over the executive board, but they don't fire the local staff. They keep the entire middle management team in place.
Right, because they need them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They kept Christian scribes like Basilios around because they were the only ones who actually knew how the software worked. They knew the terrain, they knew who owned which farm, they knew the tax base.
That is a perfect analogy. The new Umayyad state relied entirely on these pre-existing Christian scribes who were writing in Greek and Coptic. They didn't bring in some massive Arab bureaucracy because they just didn't have one yet.
Right.
In fact, there's this technique papyrologists use called ductus variance. It's the study of the physical strokes of the pen, the actual handwriting. And when they look at the earliest Arabic tax receipts, the physical handwriting perfectly matches the Greek receipts from before the conquest.
Wait, really? The exact same handwriting?
The exact same handwriting. It was the exact same people sitting at the exact same desks, doing their exact same jobs. They just, slowly started writing different headers at the top of the page.
Subhanallah. So they essentially just Arabicized the old Byzantine tax system. So that kind of covers the who of the tax collection. But we need to talk about the what. What were they actually collecting? Because I think the biggest myth we need to look at is this idea of the head tax.
Oh, yes. The poll tax reductionism.
Right, because the popular perception today is that the jizya was this flat, individualized penalty, like forced onto every single non-Muslim person, regardless of how much money they had, just as a punishment for existing.
Yeah, and the ledgers completely shatter that illusion. In the early decades after the conquest, the administration actually used the terms jizya and kharaj interchangeably.
Really? They weren't separate things?
Not initially, no. The system they used was adapted straight from a Greek tax concept called endrismos, and while that translates roughly to a man tax or census tax, it was absolutely not a flat fee levied on individuals.
Okay, so how did it work then?
It was a collective, community-wide assessment. It was based entirely on the agricultural yield of the whole village.
So the caliph in Damascus wasn't like sending soldiers door to door to shake down individual farmers for a gold coin.
Far from it. The central government would look at a region, figure out its overall productive capacity, usually based on how high the Nile flooded that year, and then they'd hand a collective tax bill to the local Christian authority, someone like our friend Basilios.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, and then it was entirely up to Basilios and the local village elders to distribute that tax burden internally. They would sit down and decide, okay, this family had a great harvest, they can pay more. This family's crops failed, they need relief. The rigid separation of jizya as only an individual head tax and kharaj as only a land tax, that was a structural thing developed by urban scholars centuries later.
Okay, wait, let me play devil's advocate for a second here. Because if I go to a library right now and I pull down classical Islamic law books from, say, the 9th or 10th century, some of them explicitly describe humiliating rituals for paying the jizya.
Yes, they do.
Like things about striking the taxpayer on the neck or forcing them to stand while the collector sits or making them wear distinctive belts. If these famous, highly respected medieval scholars explicitly wrote those rules down, why should we trust these dusty papyrus receipts over the official law books?
That is a very fair question. But we have to separate urban imperial theory from rural administrative pragmatism.
Oh.
Those humiliating rituals you're talking about, they were Abbasid-era codifications.
So like later on.
Right. They emerged in the 9th and 10th centuries, and they were heavily influenced by much older Persian administrative customs where all citizens actually wore identifiable clothes to show their social class, regardless of religion. But more importantly, the most prominent master jurists of the classical era scholars, like Imam al-Nawawi, they actually condemned those physical rituals. They called them illegal, abusive innovations.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And when we look at the actual 7th and 8th century papyri from the rural areas, there is zero evidence of any physical degradation during tax collection. The receipts are just written with standard professional respect.
Okay, but what about the primary text itself? Because chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran talks about fighting those who do not believe until they pay the jizya, and then it uses the phrase, wahum sagirun, which is usually translated as, while they are humbled or subdued. Doesn't that explicitly mean a state of humiliation?
Well, this is where philological analysis, just looking at the historical meaning of the words, is so crucial. Early scholars and modern semantic historians have looked at the root word, sagar, in its political context, and it denotes macro-political submission to a state's legal framework. It doesn't mean personal, physical degradation.
Right.
You have to look at the context of the verse. It was revealed during the Tabuk expedition, right when there was an imminent Byzantine military mobilization. It was about regulating the end of hostilities. Paying the tax, Waham Sagaran, meant accepting the sovereignty of the new state and ending the war.
So it's basically like signing a peace treaty.
Exactly. It meant the fighting stops. It did not mean inflicting daily psychological torture on a peaceful Coptic farmer in the Nile Delta who's just trying to harvest his wheat.
That distinction between macro-political submission to a government and personal humiliation is, it's vital. And realizing that these Christian and Jewish farmers were the absolute economic bedrock of the empire. It brings us to what I thought was the most surprising thing in these archives.
Big conversion issue.
Yes. Because if this system was so completely reliant on non-Muslim taxpayers to keep the lights on, what happens when those taxpayers actually want to join the ruling religion? We always hear that the goal of the conquest was forced conversion, but the ledgers show the state acting against the spread of Islam.
It is a massive historical paradox. The early Umayyad state actively discouraged mass conversions, and the reason was entirely macroeconomic.
Okay, let me make sure I've got the mechanics of this right. If a Christian farmer converts to Islam legally, they drop out of the Jizyah and Kharaj tax brackets, and they move into the Zakat tax bracket, which was significantly lower.
Precisely. And the state had inherited a very fragile agricultural economy. If an entire province of Egyptian farmers suddenly converted to Islam, they'd stop paying those heavy agricultural taxes. The state would lose its main revenue stream overnight.
But their expenses weren't shrinking.
No, they had massive overhead. They had to fund military garrisons, pay salaries for administrators like basilios, and maintain vital infrastructure.
Right, the infrastructure projects in these sources are just staggering. They were reinvesting massive amounts of tax money back into the local provinces, dredging the Nile canals, repairing dikes. They even maintained Trajan's Canal, this massive waterway linking the Nile to the Red Sea.
Yeah, and who benefited from that? The local Christian and Jewish merchants, because it connected their goods to this huge intercontinental trade network.
But all that engineering costs money.
Exactly. The Umayyad governors realized that if everyone converted, the agrarian tax base would literally collapse, the canals would silt up, the army wouldn't get paid, and the empire would just fragment.
You know, I was trying to think of how to frame this for someone today, and it's basically like a freemium app.
A freemium app?
Yeah, like imagine a software company has a free version of their app that runs entirely on ad revenue, and they have a premium ad-free version. But then the company realizes that if every single user upgrades to the premium tier, they'll actually go bankrupt.
Yeah.
Because their entire global server network is funded by the ad revenue from the free users.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right, so what does the company do? They start making it incredibly difficult to upgrade. They hide the premium button in a maze of menus. They put up all these bureaucratic roadblocks. And that is exactly what the Umayyad governors were doing to non-Muslims who tried to convert.
That is a brilliant analogy, and it completely dismantles the whole conversion by the sword myth. I mean, you don't use the sword to force people into a religion if you are simultaneously relying on them staying out of it to fund your treasury.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
Right. And the historical reality is that early governors like Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf in Iraq, they put up immense barriers. They demanded new converts prove they were circumcised, or they made them recite the Quran perfectly before they would change their tax status. They just wanted to delay the loss of revenue.
Which, when you step back and look at the theology of Islam, is a wild contradiction.
It was a profound internal crisis because the governor's actions directly contradicted core Islamic theology, which is all about universal salvation and spreading the message. And this tension just built up until the reign of Caliph Umar II.
Right, the reforms.
Yeah. He saw what the governors were doing and instituted a massive reform. He wrote to his governors with that famous line, "God sent Muhammad as a guide, not a tax collector."
Final law.
He immediately stopped the taxation of converts. He prioritized the spiritual message over the treasury, even though he knew full well it was going to cause a massive short-term financial crisis.
That kind of ideological course correction is just fascinating. But it does bring us to a lingering question that I think a lot of people will have. We've established it wasn't a mafia protection racket and it wasn't a tool for forced conversion. But we still have to look at the actual math of the disparity between the groups.
You mean the disparity in the tax rates?
Right, because modern critics will still say the system was fundamentally unfair. Non-Muslims were paying jizya and kharaj, which could take up, 33 to 50% of their crop yields. Meanwhile, Muslims only paid zakat, which is traditionally just 2.5% of surplus wealth. So even if it's just administrative, doesn't that huge financial disparity act as a form of economic coercion?
Well, that is the most common critique today. But it relies on a very anachronistic comparison. You can't just compare Jizyah to Zakat on a simple spreadsheet. You have to compare the total civic burden required by the state.
Okay, what do you mean by total civic burden?
Well, Zakat wasn't just a low wealth tax. Being a Muslim in the early empire came with the mandatory obligation of personal military service, the literal shedding of blood.
Ah, the military draft.
Exactly. A Muslim farmer could be pulled from his field, required to buy his own sword and horse, and march to the frontiers of Central Asia to defend the state, often for years at a time. The Zakat was a wealth tax, but the real tax was a blood tax.
And the Jizyah for the non-Muslim was fundamentally a military service exemption fee.
Precisely. Non-Muslims were entirely exempted from the military draft. They didn't have to buy weapons, they didn't have to leave their families, and they didn't risk their lives on the frontiers. They stayed home and tended their crops.
So they contributed to the defense financially, while Muslims contributed physically.
Yes. And we even see in the papyri and the legal texts that if a non-Muslim voluntarily enlisted for military defense, they were instantly and automatically exempted from paying the jizya, and they were often given a state stipend on top of it.
Oh, wow. That completely changes the math. Because if you monetize the value of buying armor and weapons, plus the years of lost labor from being away at war, the burden balances out significantly. Plus, there was a whole list of automatic exemptions for the jizya, right? It wasn't applied to every non-Muslim.
No, not at all. The jizya automatically excluded women, children, the elderly, the disabled, monks, and the destitute. It was specifically for able-bodied men of military age who could actually earn a living. And as for the Quraysh land tax, early jurists established that it was a rent tied to the soil itself, not the soul of the person working it.
Meaning what?
Meaning, if a Muslim bought a plot of Quraysh land from a Christian, that Muslim paid the exact same 33 to 50% Quraysh rate as the Christian farmer next door.
Wow. And there's also this incredible legal mechanism I saw in the research about a refund clause. Because if the jizya was fundamentally a fee for military protection, what happens if the state couldn't actually protect the people who paid it?
Yes, the Dima contract, the Pact of Protection, was legally binding in both directions. If the Islamic State failed to protect a region from invasion, the tax legally had to be returned.
Has that actually happened historically?
It has. We have a famous instance with the military commander Abu Ubaidah at the Battle of Yarmouk. When he realized his army was outnumbered by the advancing Byzantines, he knew he had to retreat. He could no longer guarantee the safety of the Christian communities in the Levant, so he ordered his treasurers to fully refund the jizya revenues back to the local populations.
That's incredible.
Yeah, they had paid for a service military protection that the state could no longer provide, so the money was returned. I mean, you simply do not see mafia protection rackets refunding their victims when a rival gang shows up.
No, definitely not. And when you zoom out and look at the overall financial burden of this new system compared to what the farmers dealt with before, the consensus from the papyri shows the tax burden under the early caliphate was actually lower, more predictable, and way less arbitrary than under the Byzantine Empire.
Oh, absolutely. The Byzantines routinely debased their currency to fund endless wars. They levied crushing emergency wartime taxes that would just wipe out entire villages. And the new administration also abolished the coercive Byzantine religious ties that had marginalized non-Orthodox Christians, like the Copts.
So if the math actually balanced out with the military service, and there were strict exemptions and legally binding refund clauses, we have to address the elephant in the room. Why did the system eventually gain such a terrible reputation among minority communities in later centuries?
Well, because all bureaucratic systems, no matter how well designed, eventually decay. What started as a highly pragmatic, localized, and strictly regulated agrarian assessment in the 7th century, it eventually hardened and corrupted. By the later Mamluk and Ottoman periods, the state transitioned away from direct tax collection. They started using what's known as the ICTA system.
And the ICTA system is essentially tax farming, right? Where the state just auctions off the right to collect taxes.
Exactly. Instead of the caliph paying a salary to a local governor to collect a fair tax, the state would auction off a whole province to a private contractor or a military officer. That contractor pays the state a massive lump sum up front, and in return, they get the right to go into that province and extract as much revenue as they possibly can from the villages to make their profit.
No, that's just a recipe for disaster.
It completely removed the state's oversight and incentivized extreme corruption. These private middlemen ruthlessly squeezed the peasantry, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. So the systemic poverty and abuse we associate with the later periods of the empire, that was a result of macroeconomic decline and the corruption of tax farming. It was not the original legal framework of the early caliphate that we see in these papyri.
Sitting here, looking at the entire arc of this, it really is an incredible journey. We started out looking at these highly charged modern internet debates, and we ended up staring at the quiet, undeniable truth of 1,400-year-old papyrus receipts. It just reminds you that history isn't just written by the victors with their grand chronicles. It's preserved by the accountants in the margins of the ledgers. When you are trying to understand a complex historical conflict, you really always have to follow the money.
That is the true value of forensic paperology. It cuts through the noise of centuries of religious and political propaganda, and it forces us to look at the daily reality of human beings who are just trying to manage a society and survive. And, if we connect this micro-level data to the bigger picture, it leaves us with a very profound question to consider.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
We often look back at the ancient world and we automatically assume that every conflict, every conquest, every policy was driven by deep, unyielding religious zealotry. We assume people in the past were entirely motivated by theology. But based on these very mundane, pragmatic financial ledgers, we have to ask ourselves how much of what we casually call holy war or religious history was actually just the pragmatic macroeconomics of late antiquity.
Yeah.
How many other massive ideological conflicts throughout history are really just disguising a very human, very mundane dispute over agrarian land rents?
Yeah. That is a thought that will definitely stick with you long after we wrap up today. Thank you so much for bringing these sources in. It's been absolutely fascinating. To rebuild your mental peace and legacy today, give charity, sponsor a student, and plant a